Good evening, everyone. You know, I've never been to Little Rock before. I always wondered what it would be like to come to Little Rock. You'd hear about it on the news all the time. I was a big fan of Billy Boy. And I'd always wonder, you know, he's from Little Rock. What is that like? So here I am. So you're my introduction. So I've been studying choice for nearly 2 decades now, and I recently came out with this book called The Art of Choosing. And Nikolai invited me here tonight to talk about the relationship between leadership and choice. Now, that's a pretty complicated subject. So, as I talk tonight, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want to get your help with this subject. So I'm going to ask you some questions. I want to know your answers. Now, since I'm blind, if I ask you a question, only raise your hands if you want to burn off some calories, maybe get some exercise. Okay. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is I'll ask you a question, a yes or no question, and if your answer is yes, just clap your hands. Otherwise, no need to do anything. So the first question is, are you ready? Are we all awake? Thank you. Thank you. So, it's often said that everything begins with a story. So, I'm going to start with a story. I want to start with a story about 2 men who made 2 very different choices. One was a military general, and the other one was a Zen master. During the feudal wars in Japan, there used to be this great military general, and he was known for never having a single defeat. He would quickly sweep into a town, village, a region, invade, often killing everybody he met upon sight, never had a single defeat. Well, on one occasion, when he landed up in the village, he found that everybody had already run away. Good idea. Everybody had run away, that is, except for one Zen master. Now, he was curious about this guy who chose not to flee. He decided to pay him a visit in the temple. He got there, and he found that he wasn't being given the kind of deference that he was used to. "You fool," he shouted as he reached for his sword. "Don't you realize that you are standing before a man that can run you through without blinking an eye? And don't you realize," the Zen master responded, "that you are standing before a man that can be run through without blinking an eye?" Now, you might ask, what is this story about? Is it fear? Is it a story about arrogance, courage, wisdom? I think it's a story about leadership. So if I ask you the question, who's the leader? Was it the military general? How many people would say yes? I guess not. Would you say it was the Zen master? Well, what is leadership? Leadership is the ability to exercise control over oneself as well as over others around one. Of course, we all have very different definitions of what it means to have control. So this general, he might have been the one who held the sword, but it was the Zen master who was more in control. The general was the one who had the upper titles, the higher ranks, but it was the Zen master who was the one who was more self-controlled, self-assured, confident. The general couldn't see past his own face, but the Zen master had something to teach us. If you define leadership through stiff hierarchy, then the leader is the person who's at the top of the ladder. Perhaps he was born there, perhaps he clawed his way up there. The important thing is that he's the big man with the big title who sits in the big office, who probably also has a very big salary. At worst, he's a big-mouthed tyrant that can get away with just about anything because of his claims to the highest rung. Now, at best, he speaks softly, but carries a very big stick. Now, this might sound like a bit of an exaggeration, But all too often, it's the person who gets to wear the tag that says, "Hi, my name is the leader," who gets to exercise authority. But a title doesn't make you any more of a leader than does holding a sword make you an expert swordsman. Each of us has it in us to be a leader, regardless of what our tag says. Take a look at these photos. I'm sure you recognize most, if not all, the people here. Every single one of them were leaders, whether or not you agree with their philosophies and practices. What did they do to earn people's respect? How did they come to exercise the control so fundamental to leadership? Was it fate? You know, don't you ever get the impression that there's just some people out there that are just born leaders, possessing this almost supernatural power to draw others to them? Or was it chance? It really does feel at times that there just happen to be some lucky people at the right place at the right time and are therefore given opportunities to be leaders. Or is it choice? Fate and chance may play some role, but are they really sufficient? You know, in the end, choice is the only one of these forces that puts control in your hands. It's the only tool we have that enables us to go from who we are today to whom we want to be tomorrow. And so it is necessarily the most powerful tool any of us have to forge our own paths and to guide others who trust and rely upon us. Ultimately, we are all judged by the choices we make. And so if we aim to become better leaders, we must study how to improve our choice making. So what does a leader need to know and do to get the most from choice? I'm going to talk about 4 principles today. And all of these are backed up by lots of scientific research. First, recognize that we are all born with an innate need to be in control. It's essential for our success, for our happiness. An effective leader doesn't just maintain control, but distributes it, sometimes even relinquishes it. When people feel like they have control, they can accomplish some pretty amazing things. Let's take an extreme case. I'm going to tell you the story of a man named Steve Callahan. He was an avid, skilled sailor. Way back in 1982, he decided to create his own little boat and set off on a boat race. He took off just off the coast of the Canary Islands and headed for the Caribbean. But less than a week out at sea, disaster struck. His boat was capsized in the midst of a storm. He was now stuck in a leaky, inflatable raft. No food, no supplies, no way to navigate. In the critical hours after the storm, he wrote in his autobiographical sketch, "I am captain of my tiny ship in treacherous waters. I now have a choice to make." Are you all right over there? "I now have a choice to make. I can either pilot myself to a new life or give up and watch myself die. I choose to kick for as long as I can." Desperate as his situation was, he decided he had a choice to make. And by conceiving of his circumstances in terms of choice, he was able to regain some measure of control. He collected rainwater for drinking. He fashioned his own makeshift spear and did some fishing. Sometimes barnacles were attracted to those fish, and so he ate those too. When his weak body would allow it, he did yoga. To maintain his sanity, he wrote in his diary. Other than that, he drifted west. 76 days later, he was actually found just off the coast of Guadeloupe. To this day, he is the only person to have survived more than a month lost at sea. Now, you're probably thinking, gosh, well, he clearly got lucky. Skill helped him out quite a bit. Choice really is no guarantee that you're going to survive a catastrophic situation, but it might just encourage you to go the extra mile, help align the odds ever so slightly in your favor. I've been studying successful individuals, effective leaders, for many years now. And no matter what point in history you look at, there is one common ingredient to all of them. They all possess an ability to see choice where others saw no choice. Every single one of us, at some point in our lives, will experience adversity. And at that moment in time, we all have a choice to make. We can either see our circumstances as destiny and give in to that, or give in to the misfortunes that we've been dealt, or we can see our lives in terms of choice. What is still possible? And the more we are able to conceive of our lives in terms of what is still possible, the more we will be able to electrify ourselves with the power of choice. Just as importantly, an effective leader is able to electrify others with the power of choice. If you treat people around you as mere cogs in the wheel, then at best that's all they're going to deliver. Now, if you want to empower others with choice, the most obvious way to do that is to give them choices. Let's take children. Many of us have kids here. You give a child small choices, like what color marker would you like to jot down your math homework questions with, your answers down with. That small choice, trivial as it might sound, can actually increase their interest in mathematics, will increase their performance. Let's take a typical study. You bring in children in one group, they're given 6 different choices of which word activity to do, versus they're told which word activity to do. The kids that have a choice, they perform better, they're more motivated to do that task when they're no longer required to do it. Anytime you take a routine job and give people choices, say a bank teller's job, you give them choices. The more choices they have, the more satisfied they are, the better they perform. On average, we see a 25% increase in performance, a 40% increase in satisfaction. Take an extreme case like Google. They allow you to take 20% of your time. You can do anything you want as long as it supposedly has some vague connection to Google. Well, it turns out 50% of their new ideas come out of that 20% time. If it wasn't for that 20% time, we wouldn't have things like Gmail and Google Talk and Google News and the other competitor of Facebook, Orkut, which is very popular actually in other parts of the world. So when you give people choices, not only do they perform better, they become more satisfied, they become more creative, but it turns out it actually improves our health. There was a famous study done in the UK with nearly 10,000 people. It's called the Whitehall Studies. It followed people for decades. And it looked at their feelings about how much choice they had in their daily work lives and how this affected their health. How many sick days they took, their blood pressure rates, prone to heart disease. Well, contrary to our stereotypic image of the hard-charging boss, the type A personality, no doubt, who drops dead of a heart attack at the age of 50. They found the opposite. People that felt they had very little to no control at their jobs, people stuck photocopying all day, people stuck being a doorman. These sorts of jobs were more likely to lead people to call in more sick days, experience higher blood pressure rates. All things being equal, they were more likely to die of a heart attack at the age of 50. Even when we can't give people choices over the content of what they do, simply giving them small choices, like how to organize your day, when to take breaks, how to frame your work goals. Those small choices go a long way towards increasing performance, lowering turnover rates, and improving people's health. Ultimately, it is the perceptions of choice and the feelings of control that they generate that lead to these benefits. Now, Although we are all born with an innate desire for choice, and we share this with animals as well, we still don't all see choices in the same places or to the same extent. It turns out our culture shapes both our perceptions of and our expectations from choice. Recently, I've been doing a whole bunch of interviews with people from all different parts of the world. I interview people that are walking along in the park, the homeless, taxi cab drivers, waiters, waitresses, college students, executives, and exec ed type programs. And I ask them questions about all the different choices they make in their life, from the very trivial to the very consequential. Well, on one occasion, I was in Moscow and I was interviewing a bunch of MBA students. I found that one of my aha moments didn't come from a particular question that I asked them. It actually came from a very simple gesture of hospitality. Before we began our session, I offered them a set of sodas to have as we chatted. Didn't want them to get dehydrated or anything. So I offered them these sodas. Actually, let me show you these sodas. How many choices are there? You can call them 7, right? That's exactly what I thought. Well, there was this one guy, this MBA student. They're usually the higher wealth bracket in Russia. And he says, "Oh, but it doesn't matter. It's all just soda. That's just one choice." One choice? But God, they had Coke, Pepsi, Mountain Dew, Sprite. I mean, look, scientists may tell us that we can't tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi, but you and I know the difference between Coke and Pepsi. By the way, Coke is better. Well, I was curious about his comment, and from then on I started to present the same set of 7 sodas to all the different participants, and I asked them, how many choices are these? And again, residents of ex-communist countries saw these not as 7 different sodas, they saw them as one soda. Well, so it turns out our culture teaches us a lot about choice. It teaches us how much choice we want, it teaches us how we think choices should be made, it teaches us whom we think should make the choice, it teaches us what constitutes a meaningful choice. Now, these residents of ex-communist countries had suddenly been deluged by this huge availability of choices in their marketplace. They weren't given any preparation, they were thrown in, expected to know how to swim without being taught how to swim. And so when I asked people about this experience, they said things like, well, there was one Polish man that framed it quite succinctly. He said, I don't need this much choice. I don't mean to say that there should be no choice, but too many of these choices are artificial. When I was a graduate student, I actually did my first study on culture. And what I did was I did a very similar study that I showed you just a few minutes ago. It was with those, remember the study I told you with kids, where they were given a choice of activity versus told what to do? Well, I did that same study, but this time I did it with Asian American children and Anglo-American children. They were all living in the United States. In fact, they were all living in San Francisco. And now I divided them up into 3 groups. In one group, they came in and they were given the same word activities. Which one of these 6 activities would you like to do? Which color marker would you like to use to write down your answers? Second group, they came in, they're greeted by an experimenter, Miss Smith, acts like a teacher. She tells them which activity to do, which color marker to use to jot down their answers. Third group, this is where it changes on you. Now they're told that their mothers have decided which activity to do and which marker to use to write down their answers. Now, is mom going to be good or bad? Well, turns out it depends on your cultural background. Anglo-American children, they perform best when they got to choose. It didn't matter whether it was mom or Miss Smith. If anything, they did worse for mom. I mean, I still remember the horror of some of these kids when they were told that we'd ask their mothers. There was this one girl, Mary. She's like, "You asked my mother?" Well, anyway, the Asian American children, by the way, had the complete opposite effect, right? They did best when it was for mom. Okay? Second best when they got to choose, and just as poorly as the Anglo-Americans when it was Miss Smith, this person who they'd never met before in their lives. And in contrast to Mary, the Japanese kids, well, they were really interested in having mom know. This little girl named Natsumi, she starts tugging on Miss Smith's skirt and says, "Could you please tell my mommy I did it just like she said?" Very different reaction, right? Well, these first-generation children were influenced by their immigrant parents' approach to choice. Let's think about one of the holy grail assumptions in American culture. If a choice affects me, then I should be the one to make it. That's what will guarantee my success and happiness. But for these children, these Asian American children, they had been taught a different message. For them, making sure that I made the, quote, right choice was better made by someone whom I trusted. Someone whom I had the faith was going to make the, quote, right choice. If anything, I'm going to be more motivated knowing that that person made it for me, ensuring that I can perform my best. Now, it turns out that this difference in perception doesn't just affect children. It also affects people in the work environment. A number of years ago, I did a study with Citibank, and this was done during the time of John Reed as well as during the transition with Sandy Weil. And what we looked at was people's perceptions of autonomy in their workplace and how this affected their performance. And we looked at people from all different backgrounds. And we went around the world also collecting data. We surveyed people from lots of different positions in the consumer bank. So bank tellers, different kinds of Salesforce representatives, assistant managers, managers, all the way up the ladder in consumer banking. Well, here's what we found. Americans, even though, by the way, their jobs are supposedly completely standardized, and from all, at least outward signals, they are standardized, independent of their job positions, Americans perceive themselves as making more choices in a typical day at their job than did Latin Americans, people from Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, who in turn perceived themselves as making more choices as compared to people from Asian countries, Singapore, Philippines, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Now, even when you compared employees that were all working under the same manager in the United States, exposed to American culture, in the same branch, in fact, under the same roof, again, you saw the same effect. Anglo-Americans perceived themselves as making more choices as compared to Hispanic Americans, who in turn perceived themselves as making more choices as compared to the Asian Americans. Now, these differences in perception matter because it turns out that they affect performance differently. We saw 3 different groups, 3 entirely different relationships between autonomy and performance. Anglo-Americans, the more choices they felt they had, the better they performed. The fewer sick days they took, the more satisfied they were with their jobs. Hispanic Americans and Latin Americans, well, choice didn't hurt them. It actually mildly positively affected them. It just wasn't the thing that really made the difference. For them, what affected their performance the most was whether they thought that they could trust their manager, that their manager was actually a good person. They had good rapport with this person. If they felt that way, performance went up, satisfaction went up. Now, for Asians and Asian Americans, you saw yet a third pattern. The more choices they felt they had, the worse they performed, and the less satisfied they were. Why? Because they felt like their manager just didn't know what he or she was doing. Had it wrong. So our culture how much we value choice in our typical day, which then affects our perception. So if you're someone who values choice, well, you're going to see every single activity that you do over the course of a day as falling into that category called choice. If you're somebody that doesn't have as much value for choice, well, you're going to reserve that category to just a few of the activities you do in a day. If you feel like you have a lot of choice, well, this could be really empowering. But it could also feel as if you're being buried under pointless minutia. If you feel like you have a little choice, well, this can feel very stifling. My God, they're giving me no autonomy. They're controlling me. This is just not right. Or it can feel as if you were being given the right amount of guidance and direction. The key to being an effective leader is not giving people the kinds of choices that you had been given. It's giving people the kinds of choices that will most inspire them. So it's knowing where they're coming from, understanding the perspective from which they're coming from. Well, so often when you travel abroad, you learn some things about those other cultures, but you learn more about your own culture because you learn how you're different. So one of the things that I learned as I was exploring this topic, choice, and people's notions of who should make a choice versus no choice, was I started to wonder about things in my own choice-loving American culture. And I started to ask myself questions like, well, is there a limit to how much choices we should have? So if I ask you, would you like it if you had more choices in your life today? What would you say? Yes? I heard some claps. I'm not hearing everybody clap. Are the rest of you just shy, or you're not sure? Seems like a trick question, right? Think about all the choices you make today. You can choose your careers, you can choose your spouses, you can choose where you want to live, you can choose how you want to live, how you want to schedule your entertainment, which one of 100 different kinds of jams you want to spread across your toast in the morning, more than that, different flavors and brands of soda pop you want to have with your meal. You know, in 1949, the average grocery store offered you only 3,700 products. Today, it offers you 45,000 products. Yes. The typical Walmart, and this is Walmart land, right? The typical Walmart offers you 100,000 products. Okay? You want a book? Amazon.com offers you 27 million bucks. Now here's the good news. If you're lonely, okay, just go on Match.com. There's 15 million date possibilities. Right. We want choice. We want more choices because the more choices we have, the more opportunities we have to find the perfect match. But how do we actually react when we have all these choices? Well, when I was a graduate student and I came back from doing a stint in Japan, I used to go to this grocery store. It was a very fancy, upscale grocery store. It was called Draeger's. Some of you may have even read about it in the newspapers. Well, this store was not a normal grocery store. This was a specialty grocery store that offered you lots and lots and lots of choice. 250 different kinds of mustards, vinegars, mayonnaises, 500 different kinds of fruits and vegetables, over a dozen different kinds of bottled water. And this is at a time when we actually used to drink tap water. Let me give you an example. This is their olive oil aisle. They had 75 different kinds of olive oil. And this, by the way, doesn't include the olive oils that were in the locked case, you know, the olive oils that actually came. Well, I used to go to this store, and it was fun. It was like going to an amusement park. Contemplate all the possibilities. And by the way, every week there used to be these busloads of tourists that would come, cameras ready, taking pictures. So it seemed to have a lot of traffic. But one day I noticed that I never bought anything. Now, true, I was a poor graduate student. I didn't have a whole lot of money, but I could probably afford to buy a bottle of mustard. I decided to pay a visit to the manager, and I asked him whether his model of offering people all these choices was really working. He said, "Well, haven't you seen all the customers?" I said, "Yes, but is it working?" So we decided to do this little experiment. And this experiment is called the jam study. So we picked the jam, the product jam, Wilkin & Sons, and we put out either 6 different flavors of Wilkin & Sons jam or 24 different flavors of Wilkin & Sons jam on a tasting booth. And we set up this tasting booth right by the entrance of the store. Okay? And we looked at 2 things. First, in which case are people more likely to sort of stop and sample some jam? You know, passers-by, yeah, you see these tasting booths in grocery stores all the time. It's kind of cool to sample some of this stuff. Second, we gave them all a coupon giving them $1 off if they bought a jar of jam. So we wanted to see in which case were people more likely to buy a jar of jam. Well, more people stopped when they were 24. 60% stopped versus 40% stopped when they were 6. But when it came down to buying, you saw the opposite effect. Of the people who encountered 24, only 3% of them actually bought a jar of jam. Of the people who encountered 6, 30% of them bought a jar of jam. So they were 10 times more likely to buy a jar of jam if they encountered 6 than if they encountered 24. Well, why is this? Let me show you the jam aisle. They actually had to go to the jam aisle to pick a jar of jam to buy it. They had 348 different kinds of jam. Well, we had this research assistant that was stationed in the jam aisle pretending to take inventory, but he was really eavesdropping on all their conversations. And we heard 2 kinds of conversations. One conversation went like this. "Boy, that lemon curd sure was good." "Yeah, it was, wasn't it? In and out of that jam aisle in less than 30 seconds. The other kind of conversation went like this. "That lemon curd sure was good, wasn't it? Yeah, you know, that Victoria plum was interesting too. What about Little Scarlet? We never tried that." This conversation could go on for a minute, sometimes 2 minutes. There were some conversations that went on for 10 minutes. Invariably, somebody says, "Look, let's just come back to jam. There's so much other stuff to check out in the store." Who knows if they ever came back to jam? Ironically, they were attracted to the larger display of choices, but that paralyzed them during the choosing moment. You know, our grandmothers always told us that our eyes are too big for our stomachs, but our eyes are actually too big for our minds, too. We might enjoy gazing at these big walls of jams, mustards, vinegars, but we can't actually do the math of picking from that stunning display. There was a famous study done in 1956 by a guy named George Miller, who was a famous psychologist from Harvard. And he did a study that was called the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. If you remember nothing else tonight, remember that. And what he showed was the limitations of our brains. So let's say I ask you to rank order from worst to best, a whole bunch of things. Pretty women, smells, a bunch of cakes, tastes, anything. Beyond about 7, you get confused. You thought you liked the blonde, but now you're thinking maybe the brunette, or vice versa. You get confused in your mind. If I ask you to keep track of a bunch of information in your heads, words, numbers, pictures, beyond about 7, the information just starts to crumble away. Unless you practice or rehearse in some way, at that moment in time, that's all you can really keep track of. Well, what is a choice? It's a bundle of information. What are you doing when you make a choice? You're comparing one bundle of information against other bundles and bundles of more and more bundles of information. This gets complicated. The value of choice depends on our ability to perceive differences between the options. And if we can't see how one option is different from another option, and we can't compare and contrast them, well, we become confused and frustrated. We see we see three negative consequences to offering people more choice. And these are coming from studies that I did the JAM study, but since then it's been now over 10 years. So there's been lots of people that have been doing studies on this phenomenon known as choice overload. And you see three main negative consequences. The more choices people have, the more likely they are to procrastinate, stick to the status quo, even when that goes against their best interests. Second, they're more likely to choose things that are worse for them when they make a choice, pick inferior choices, investment choices, healthcare choices. They even act kind of oddly when it comes down to speed dating settings. When they have more rather than fewer options, that's a whole nother story. Also, even when people actually manage to get it right and actually make a really good choice, they're less satisfied. People will get like 20% higher salaries because they got lots of choices and they were able to make the quote-unquote best choice. And they sit around wondering, oh gosh, did I choose the right one? What if I had chose that one? The most interesting thing that we do when we have a lot of choices is we start thinking about options that didn't really exist. They only exist in our minds, and compare that to the option that we actually chose but now feel like we're stuck with. So, have you ever thought about how many choices you make in a given week? You should do that exercise sometime. Of course, you make thousands of choices every single day, but the ones that you're consciously aware of, think about it. How many choices did you make last week? How much time did you spend per choice? There was a study done in 2006 that followed a bunch of CEOs. And it kept track of which choices they made in a given week and how much time they spent on these choices. Average number of choices that a CEO made, conscious choices, 139. But most of these were made up of many sub-choices. It's actually much more than 139. 50% of those choices were made in 9 minutes or less. 12% of those choices, 1 hour or more. We have a lot of choices to make. We need to make sure that the choices that make it into that 1 hour category are the ones that are really important. We need to make sure that the choices that make it into that 9-minute category are the ones that are either not so important, or the ones that we're delegating out to other people that will actually do a good job with them. One of the things that I often do with my MBA students is I tell them to jot down all the things that are important to them. And you can make that list as long as you want. I encourage all of you to try this out too at home. And then I tell them, cross off everything other than the top 5. If you've got one thing, you'll do it really, really well. 3 things, you'll do it well. 5 things, you'll do solid. Beyond that, it just becomes hard for our minds to keep track of it. Be choosy about what you choose. Now, when you make a difficult choice and you want to make it right, how do you do it? The way you do it is you cultivate something known as informed intuition. Now, some of you who have read maybe Blink might recognize this guy. His name is Paul Van Riper. Well, maybe not all of you recognize it, but anyway, this guy was written about in Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink. It's a wonderful example of a guy that really made some great choices, kind of the kind of person that we all want to be like. He was a military guy, fought a lot in Vietnam War, was considered to be quite a hero, made a lot of difficult choices, made those difficult choices in the moment. He was selected to engage in the Millennium War Project that was conducted by the Pentagon. And this project was done in 2002. What they did in this war game, it was a fake war game in preparation for going into the Gulf, Middle East in general, was they set up 2 teams. The blue team, the United States along with their allies, and the red team, the rogue leader that was threatening to destabilize the region in the Middle East. Well, The blue team had all the technology, had all the information. They were ready to do a rational analysis. They had 100 different analysts. They were constantly comparing all the options, figuring out what strategy to employ when. They had all the information about their enemy. The head of the enemy, or the person who played the role of the enemy, was Mr. Paul Van Riper. Now, his attitude was quite the opposite of the Pentagon. He said, war is by definition chaotic. It's by definition uncertain. What are you, crazy? I'm going to compare all these options? No way. I'm going to use my gut. I'm going to use good judgment in the moment. I'm not going to compare and contrast and all that. Well, when they actually did the real war game, they found that the red team actually beat the blue team hollow. So when the blue team actually struck out all the information sources available to the red team, what did Mr. Van Riper said? He said, no problem, I'll just send out some messages through the mosques and their prayers, hand-delivered messages. I don't need technology for this. And they took out all his main equipment, his ships. No problem, I'll just get some civilian boats. I'll put missiles in these civilian boats, and I'll launch them against the American ships. In that game, he sunk 16 American ships, which, if it had been real, would have led to 20,000 lives lost. Would have been the worst Navy defeat since Pearl Harbor. Now, it's stories like this that constantly make us wonder, what should I use at that moment of that difficult choice? Do I use reason? Do I use intuition? Bush was the great icon. I knew that would get him. He was the great icon of, I trust my heart. What's Barack Obama? I'm going to use calm analysis. We've been debating about this issue, folks, since at least the Greeks. What do you use? Reason, intuition. Well, if we use pure intuition, and if we believe that if I do something over and over and over again, I'm going to get better at it, that also fails us. It fails us because simply doing something over and over again doesn't actually make us good at it. You can look at investment gurus, you can look at political pundits, you can look at people's decisions they make in terms of marriage and whether or not that leads to divorce. You can look at the activity of interviewing people. Even when you look at HR professionals, forget about the rest of us that are just trying to pick someone we like and maybe can get along with in the work environment. We do a horrible job of interviewing people and picking the people that we can actually work with. It's about a 2% likelihood that they will actually work out if you base it on an interview. If you base it on their work sample, it's about 28% likelihood that they'll work out. Reason leads us, pure reason can lead us astray. Pure intuition can lead us astray. So what do we use? What did a person like Paul Van Riper really use? He says it was gut, but it wasn't. It was what we call informed intuition, which is intuition that is based on reason. To see informed intuition in action, I want to give you the example of a chess master. I'm picking a very complicated activity to show you how informed intuition develops. At any given moment, when a chess master is contemplating, say, 8 moves ahead, at that moment, if you think about all the possible combinations of options that she has at her disposal, she has more choices available to her than the number of stars in the galaxy. But she's not actually contemplating all those choices. When she's making that choice, which seems very complicated to us, the observers, she makes it quickly. How does she make it? She makes it because she sees that chessboard not as being made up of individual pieces and individual moves. She sees that chessboard as comprised of patterns, lines of attack. What that allows her to do is throw out all those irrelevant options and zero in on that handful of most relevant options. How do you develop that kind of informed intuition? Through many hours of practice plus feedback. It's not enough to simply do it. Some people say it's the 10,000 hour effect, that you need at least 10,000 hours to actually develop true informed intuition. And it doesn't come from just doing it over and over again. I mean, we all know that. We go to a buffet, we eat too much, swear we're never going to do that again, go back to the buffet again and do it all over again. You do it, you give yourself feedback, you try it a different way, you do it again. Paul Van Riper used to regularly take notes in bushes while he was in war in Vietnam. And when he would gather up his soldiers and say, okay, what's going to be our strategy, he'd pull out these little scraps of paper out of his pocket and use that to develop his intuition. This was intuition that was developed over many, many, many years of feedback plus practice. So in the end, what is informed intuition? Well, think of it as the combination of Kirk and Spock. Right, on their own, one is way too emotional and the other one's way too logical, but you put them together and you get a pretty good combination. What is informed intuition? Ultimately, it's pattern matching. It's figuring out what you know and what the limits of that knowledge is. As Confucius once said, to know what you know and to know what you do not know, that is true knowledge. One of the great modern-day heroes of choice is Warren Buffett. But what I think is most admirable about Warren Buffett is not so much the investment choices he made. Now, admittedly, I'd be a much richer person if I had made those too. But I think what's most admirable about him are the choices he didn't make. Way back in the 1990s, there was a headline, "Warren, have you lost your touch?" He refused to invest in technology stocks. By the way, to this day, he still refuses to invest in technology stocks. He said, "I refuse to invest in something that I do not understand and I do not know where it's going." We all have a lot of choices to make. And it's important for us to be choosy about choosing, which means know your priorities, and in those priorities, develop informed intuition. The rest are things that we should be delegating out. The rest are things, if you have to make complicated choices, and you have to scale up beyond your informed intuition, beyond your personal expertise, then you need to start relying on the expertise of others. You know, one of the things that was quite interesting about visiting the Bill Clinton Library today was one of the things he really believed was he understood that he didn't know everything. And so when he had to make a complicated choice, he would bring together all these different experts. He held more cabinet meetings than any other president. It was because he understood I need to scale up my knowledge, and the only way I'm going to do that is by bringing the expertise of others to help me form good judgment. You know, in the end, leadership is not about you. It's not about power. It's not about ego. It's not about instilling fear in others so that they run upon your arrival. It's about working towards a better future by making good choices. Great leaders have sharp vision. I mean that metaphorically, of course. They know where they're headed, and they know that the way they're going to get there is by making good choices. And they regularly draw upon the very principles that I'm talking about today. So let me sum up. First, control. We all need it. Effective leaders maintain, distribute, and sometimes even relinquish it. Second, culture. Our backgrounds shape our perceptions of and expectations from choice. An effective leader accounts for these differences when deciding what choices to offer. Choice overload. We all have physical, mental, and emotional limitations to how many choices we can handle at any given moment. An effective leader recognizes the limitations of choice and uses that to get the most from choice. Informed intuition. An effective leader draws on a combination of gut and reason as well as the expertise of others to make the best choices. Now, everything I have said today is based on scientific research, and I think it's fair to say that science can make us more skillful at choosing. It can help align the odds ever so slightly in your favor. But in the end, choosing is an art. It's an art because it doesn't look the same to all eyes, nor do we all agree on its purpose. It's an art because although we can learn from other people around us, we can't replicate their choices, and we can't follow a single formula. It's an art because in order to do it well, it requires you to face yourself, to rummage inside, discover all the things you wish you didn't know, and use that to make better choices. A great leader is a dedicated practitioner of the art of choosing. She looks beyond hierarchy and reimagines new modes and means of exercising control. Like other artists, she's willing to question her choices and find new ways of achieving her goals. And perhaps most important, effective leaders understand that choice has its limitations, and sometimes, in order to appreciate its true power, you have to be willing to relinquish it. Picasso once said, "I'd like to live like a poor man with a lot of money." To me, this means a life in which you practice humility and hard work, but not out of a feeling of desperation or destitution. It means being able to recognize the worth of something, even though you have a lot of it. Recently, Narayan Murthy, the ex-CEO and founder of Infosys, addressed the Columbia University student body. And he was asked, why are people so greedy today? He said people become greedy when they lose the value of that which is free, when the only value that matters is monetary value. And so we pursue it both to our own detriment and to the detriment of others. Just as we need a certain amount of money to get by, we need a certain amount of choice to feel in control. And just as a love of money can foster greed, so too can a love of choice foster powerlessness. The trick, then, is to be able to take advantage of choice without becoming subject to it, to be able to identify those most meaningful choices in your life. Now, I promised you that I was going to answer the big question, who's a leader? So we've come to the end, and now I have to actually answer that question. I started to answer this question by giving you a story about a Zen master. And somehow I ended up at Picasso. Now, if I put those two together, here's what I get. A leader is someone who can live with nothing and yet have everything. This might sound like a lofty goal, but what is a leader if not a dreamer with a plan? Whether or not you ultimately get there, you can use choice to help you get closer. You can write your own story. Regardless of what fate or luck may have in store, when you choose with wisdom and with compassion towards others, you are on your way to mastering the art of choosing. Thank you very much.
We do have time for a couple questions, so if you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you in the back.
That was just tremendous, so thank you. My question, when you were going through the different cultures, one of the things that struck me was Anglo-American, Asian-American, and I was wondering about African-American. So when you looked at that's African-American within the American culture, and did you see any difference?
We did look at African Americans. They look very similar to Anglo-Americans with one big difference. They perceive themselves as having far fewer choices than Anglo-Americans. But the relationship between autonomy and performance is the same. If anything, the trend is slightly stronger for Anglo-Americans. They value choice even more than Anglo-Americans do.
Right here up front. She's coming.
Thank you. I heard a surgeon on NPR commenting that he had always thought he was really bright until he tried to help his mother pick out a Medicare plan. Now, I'm trying to pick out a Medicare plan, and having been a government analyst, I should know how to do this. But you are speaking about informed intuition coming to a point where you have to find out from someone who knows more than you do.
Yes.
So how does the element of trust enter into this informed intuition? Because now I'm asking the foxes about my hen house if I'm trying to talk to insurance companies.
Right, great question. In fact, by the way, Medicare Part D, while the people that did put it to use and actually thought about all the options benefited financially, the people that most needed it, the people that were in the poorest bracket, were actually less likely to sign up because they were just so confused and they didn't know who to trust. And there were also a few things that the government could have done to help people. Like there were states in which people were randomly assigned to a particular sort of package, and they just randomly assigned them to something, even if it ended up costing them more. And if you wanted to randomly assign people, they could have at least assigned them to something that was better than what they were already doing. So one thing we can do is come up with smart defaults, sort of give people actually defaults that everybody agrees that actually would be better than their status quo. But you're right, we are in an environment today where we have a lot of choice, but one of the big reasons why we can't take advantage of it is we don't know who to trust to help guide us. And just notice what happened with the recent financial crisis, right? How we were let down by those AAA ratings. Where are we supposed to go for guidance?
Right there.
So I'm agreeing with you, but I don't have a good answer for you.
So on more of a physiology standpoint, as far as choice is concerned, can you maybe elaborate on what actually happens internally when someone actually has a choice? Have you done any studies on that?
You mean when they have a lot of choices, or what kind of a choice?
When someone is able to just make a choice in general. What happens? Maybe serotonin, homeostasis.
Well, it depends
like
on the
that.
kind of choice you're making, right? If you're making a choice that's based on happiness, it'll be in the hedonic portion of your brain. If it's based on pure analytics, it'll be in the prefrontal cortex portion of your brain.
Okay. So like
It
on
depends on-
stress levels in different classes, is that affecting the you
So
were
when
talking
people
about heart
have
attacks
too
and
much
everything,
choice, we do see greater signs of stress. We do see the portion of their brain which expresses stress lights up more. We also see greater cortisone levels. You know, one of the big problems about gut and reason is that whenever you think about a happiness choice, that's a pretty big part of our lives, right? I mean, which job offer should I take? Whom should I marry? Should I marry? These are all choices about happiness. And you can't really do a lot of evaluation and feedback. I mean, you don't want to get married that many times. Right? I mean, even Elizabeth Taylor didn't quite get it right after. So, I mean, what can you do with those happiness choices? Those are really often the most difficult choices we make in our life. So, if you think about what information you're going to get from inside of you, gut will answer the question, how do I feel about that person right now? Do I love them? How do I feel? Do I really feel happy when I'm around them? Do I like that job or that job? It'll answer the question how you feel about it right now, not how you're going to feel about it tomorrow or 10 years from tomorrow. What reasoned analysis will do, say you do the pros and cons analysis, what that'll do for you is it'll tell you which one you ought to like tomorrow and 10 years from tomorrow, not which one you'll actually like. Therein lies the conflict. You can't actually answer the question, will I want to still be married to this person 15 years from now, by either using your gut or your reason. There's really only one thing you can do to help you out at that moment, and that's to look outside of you. It's to look at other people's choices and how they have fared with those choices. You look at the people that, did get married, did choose some of the job offers you were contemplating. And you look at them not tomorrow, but you look at how they fared as a function of, being in it for 10 years or 20 years, etc. And now you use your gut to answer the question, who do I think is happier? You don't ask them. You use reason to answer the question, am I like them? And don't fall prey to the uniqueness bias, because you're really not that different from everybody else. That's really your best guess as which one will make you happy.
Right here in the front row.
This isn't really a good follow-up to choosing spouses. I wondered if you had studied minimizing negatives rather than choosing between positives. For instance, you talked about jams. You're choosing a positive versus a positive. But what if you're trying to minimize negatives? Do you get, and they're both negative choices, but one might be more negative than the other. Is there a difference in that kind of choice?
Yes, there is. So you're talking about when you're choosing between a rock and a hard place, right? So I'll tell you one fun study I ran and then one very sobering study. The fun study is, if I put you in a situation where I give you, 4 awful things to eat, and you have to eat it all, versus I tell you which awful thing you're going to eat. And by the way, I could do the same thing with committee assignments in your job. Or flight schedules, right? Pretty aversive things, right? It turns out the people that don't choose are happier. Why? Because the people who choose, not only did they have to recognize that these are all awful, but they also carried the burden of actually having to pick which one was least worst. And even if they know that they chose the least worst, they're still more miserable than the person who didn't get to choose, because the person who didn't get to choose didn't really have to think about it. They just thought, oh gosh, let me just get this medicine over with. Right? So they're a little bit happier. The sobering story is that I recently read a study. It was a set of interviews with people in France and in the US, where these were parents that all had given birth to children that were born with cerebral anoxia, which is, they had lost oxygen to the brain at the time of labor. And in the United States, the parents that had this happen to them were given a choice. They could either remove the child off of life support, in which case they would die within hours, or they could leave the child on life support for a little while longer, in which case the child might still die within a matter of days, but if the child lived, it would be in a permanent vegetative state. We compared these parents' experience to that of French parents, because in France, the final decision rests with the doctor, not with the parents. Parents have veto power, but it's done by the doctor. What we looked at was in which case were parents more able to cope with the loss of their child, and in which case were they, more likely to go on, maybe have another child, etc. What we found was that the American parents, even up to a year later, were much more likely to express negative emotions. They're much more likely to be clinically depressed. They would say things like, I keep wondering, what if I had made the other choice? Or they would say things like, purposely tortured me. How did they get me to do that? Or some parents said, I feel as if I played a role in an execution. Now, Now, by contrast, the French parents were more likely to say things like, Noah was here for so little time, but in that time he gave us so much. He gave us a new perspective on life. Now, this decision is very complicated. It's complicated because when you ask American parents, would you rather have had the doctor make the choice for you? Now they all say no. They say no even though they felt guilty, they felt trapped, they felt angry, they felt depressed. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, look, we live in a culture in which we know that, our whole purpose is to choose, and to not choose would be giving up on one of our major responsibilities. So it's a very tough thing to say, what should we do in that case? Give them the choice or take it away?
You have time for one more question.
I had a hard time deciding whether to ask this question or not. But with regard to school choice, I know that everyone is aware that we have a whole lot more choices available in where we send our children and where they receive their education and what kind of schooling they get. In your opinion, in just sort of an overview kind of basis, has this helped or harmed the average education that a child receives in the United States?
Well, I actually don't even have to go to my opinion. I can just tell you what the data says. And the average American child in the last 20 years is getting worse education, but the elite are getting better educated. And that's actually a choice we have to make, right, in terms of as a nation, as a people, right? We value freedom quite a bit, but there's multiple ways in which, I talked about cultural differences in the way people from different countries think about choice, but even in our own culture, we have very different ideas about what kind of freedom is more valued. Right? What's the difference ultimately, to the extent there is differences between the Democrats and the Republicans, is their notions about freedom. Do we value freedom from, which means I will remove all barriers, you can pursue whatever it is you are capable of getting. If you have more resources, you get more. If you have greater intellect or some way merit more, you get more. That is a valued kind of freedom. Another kind of freedom is something we might call freedom to, or equal outcomes for all. It's the idea that, look, we might have been born differently, but I'm going to reach out a hand to you and level the playing field. What does that do? It increases freedom for the average, but it reduces options for the ones that might have had more resources. Both of these positions are legitimate takes on freedom, but they lead to conflict because we believe in one or the other really deep down in our hearts. We think that that's one or the other is more right. And that's where we have our conflicts. And that's at the root of the question you just asked about education.
Professor, thank you so much for coming to Little Rock.
Thank you.